Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. The lecture is going to will start very soon, so I appreciate if you could switch your mobile devices to the silent mode. Right. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, fellow colleagues, welcome to today's CLC lecture series. My name is Jean Chia, and I'm from the Center for Livable Cities. CLC, as some of you may know, is a knowledge center jointly established by M&D and Muir in 2008. Our mission is to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The center's work spans across three main areas in research, capability development, as well as promotions. Our CLC lecture series provides a platform for urban thought leaders and experts to exchange ideas and share knowledge. Now, today's lecture is part of a CLC Urban Pioneer Lecture Series, where we hope to share Singapore's urban development expertise and experience in the last 40 to 50 years. We are honored to have with us today a distinguished panel of tourism experts to share with us insights on this topic. We have, of course, Mrs Pamelia Lee, Senior Tourism Consultant, Dr. Tan Chin Nam, Senior Corporate Advisor and former Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Information, Communication and the Arts, Mr. Lim Neo Chian, former Deputy Chairman and Chief Executive of Singapore Tourism Board, and of course, Mr. Loh Lik Peng, a renowned hotelier and restaurateur. Now, today's lecture will be moderated by Dr. Lee Min Hee, our Centre's Deputy Director, and today's lecture will take a slightly different format. There will be no individual presentation, but our panelists will be sharing their experiences via a moderated dialogue with Lee Min, followed by a Q&A with the audience here. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our panelists on stage, please. I'll now hand the time over to Lee Min and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Good afternoon, distinguished guests and panelists. The theme of the discussion today is the story of Singapore's tourism development and the larger context in which this occurred in the building of our city. In many of the cities in the world, it has been a very difficult experience in getting tourism development growing in tandem within the larger issues of growing the economy, taking care of the environment, and building a high quality of life. The Singapore tourism story is unique in its integrated approach with urban development, as well as of course, the very close working relationship between public and private sector players. Today, we know that Singapore has received many top tourism awards and is the host of iconic events that attract a world audience. But how did we do this? With our land constraints, while facing the challenges in preserving our identity and heritage. This is the fascinating context in which we begin this afternoon's discussion with our very eminent panel of speakers. So what I'll do is I will introduce each of the panelists and ask them a question related to their experience, and we will actually be introducing the panelists this way. So Pamelia, as you know, is herself quite an institution in the narrative of Singapore's tourism and urban development. She has seen through many milestones and has been a dedicated advocate for many plans and visions, including recognizing the value of heritage. She was instrumental in seeing through also our first $1 billion tourism development plan. So Pamelia, you have written the book Singapore, Tourism and Me. Can you share with us the story of Singapore's tourism development and some of the milestone plans and visions that you have been working with?
Good afternoon, everyone. I see lots of friends in the audience. Well, I joined Tourism Board at the age of 31, and now I'm 71. So many things have happened and many changes have been made. Probably I could give a whole talk on battles won and battles lost, or battles given up to be astute. When I joined the tourism board, the famous places in Singapore were Change Alley, Clifford Pier, Singapore River. At that time, there was the Merlion, and by the way, the Merlion was before my time, and the Handicraft Center. The name of the organization was Singapore Tourism Promotion Board. In other words, our mandate was to promote tourism. The argument then, Hon Siu Sen and Lee Kuan Yew, was that hotels sell rooms, airlines sell seats, so somebody has to promote the destination. So that was our job. And we were not allowed to do development. After being head of marketing for 10 years, I one day got told off by a journalist. He said to me, "You're overselling Singapore. You're losing all your historic areas. Your Raffles Hotel is run down." Today it's still run down. But anyway, your Raffles Hotel is run down. What are you doing to save your city, your heritage? So at that time, it was a no-no. We would be snapped on the hand to talk about conservation of our heritage areas. So PATA, which is the Pacific Area Travel Association, had a conference to Kathmandu about heritage. So I wrote an official paper to seek approval from Mr. Tan Ai Tong so that I could go to this conference. And he rejected it because our mandate was to promote Singapore. So being smart or not smart, I'm not sure. I found out later in government, if you don't do, you suffer more than if you do, okay? So what I did was I took leave and I paid my own fee and I went. And he found out about it before I went. So he called me in, being a good Chinese fatherly type. And he said, "No, you should not do that. Once it's not approved, you should not go on your own, even if you're paying yourself and going on your own leave." So I said, "Oh, okay, I made a mistake, I'm sorry." But I didn't say I would not go. Then what happened was, I think I need my water. Then what happened was that he then, a few weeks later, what he did a few weeks later was, he then called me in one day and he said, "Since you're going to this conference, why don't you ask them to do a study of Chinatown?" It was his way of showing me that he was a fatherly figure, but that he was also covering me and a reasonable figure. Anyway, Pata did do the study, which was one of the first studies, and URA was dragged in. I think Teng Chai was around at that time. URA was dragged in to participate. And of course, they never came out and said that they wanted to conserve Chinatown and all these areas. But you know what? When we were starting to do the work, URA pulled out all the drawings. They had all the plans, all the drawings, all the wish lists hidden underneath the cabinet. So it wasn't as if they didn't want to do it. They were just waiting for the right time. Anyway, this led to the eventual 1 billion plan. And the 1 billion plan came about because we had too many hotels. Singapore was overbuilt in every area. And so this was a new area that we could introduce new developments. And this plan, which was $1 billion worth of government money, led to the conservation of Raffles Hotel. Unfortunate, Delphi Hotel was gone already. But it led to the conservation of Bugis Street, all the historic areas. And I remember when we were talking about Arab Street, I said, no, don't call it Arab Street because there's only one street. Let's call it Kampong Glam so we can save the whole area. So these are the little things that we did that made a difference. I think, and then I was invited to be on the board of URA, National Heritage Board, and of course that was happiness to me because this is the opportunity for tourism to get a piece of the pie. How many minutes more do I have? I have how many moments? Where's the girl with the number flag? Oh, 3 minutes more, okay. When I was writing my book, I met a journalist, and he said, oh, why don't you write it based on ABC? I said, oh, what a good idea. I wish I met you 3 months ago. But it was something like Alcoff Mansion, which I first saved, and I named it after the Alcoff family because I thought they were a proud Arab family that had to be remembered. Casino, you know, if we had our hands slapped to talk about heritage areas, we would have had chili in our mouth if we talked about a casino. So it wasn't that no one thought of it. It was just that we were not ready for it as a nation and as a government. Changi Chapel and Museum was one of our easiest projects because there was already a following of people who were in search of it. So that is one project that I think was easier. The Merlion, as I said, it wasn't done during my time, but it's very clever because when I thought about it, the Merlion is a fictitious creature, head of a lion, tail of a fish, and because it's fictitious, the name is also self-created, and because of that, we can legally own it. In other words, if you take a name of something else, you cannot own it. So if you're going to build a national icon, always remember that. Raffles Hotel, we went to great lengths to control the building, and we even sold the land at the back, and they had problems with the title deed. One person was a rent control tenant, and I think on threat of being acquired, they quickly got together. For decades, they couldn't get together. And I remember I took Mr. Ngiam, who was the perm sec at that time, and I took him to see the place. And I purposely walked him through the back kitchen so he could see all the poor wiring, all the back places. And then at the end of the evening, I walked him directly to the car. And he turned to me, he said, how come so short this walk? Because earlier I had taken him all the circuitous route just so that he could see the condition. Sentosa Causeway, I wrote the paper for that because there was a big argument. The argument was that should we keep it like an island or should we allow it to be linked? That you win some, you lose some. Because if we had kept it as an island, we would not have the intensity we have today. But I don't think it would be nearly as viable. And the Southern Islands, which is under me, we also have the same problem. And now with the harbor moving, I think one day we will also confront the issue of whether it should be land-linked or not. People say now, I have one more last thing. SQ, working with, how many minutes more? SQ, 0, okay, working with SQ. When I was working with SQ all these years, we had terrible battles, okay? And then I noticed, we used to have something called the kangaroo route, where people going from Australia to Europe had to stop in Singapore. So that was my big negotiation. Because if I set the price with Singapore Airlines, then that would become the price for all the other airlines to follow. And then I learned that when you work with Singapore Airlines, if they have a new flight or a new destination, then you can really go in and negotiate because they need the promotion. So it just taught me a lesson that sometimes in life, when you're working, and all of you here are working, you battle so hard, but sometimes if you work out the strategy, you can get it right, and everything is a lot easier. So I think I'll end with that.
Thank you, Pam. So we have already learned 3 very important things. Do what you think is right, even if your boss doesn't. Build fictitious national icons and get the strategy right before you begin. That's very good. So we'll move on to Chin Nam. Chin Nam saw the value of Singapore as a tourism hub within Asia and saw the value of not just bringing the world to Singapore, but also bringing Singapore to the world by developing Singapore into a top convention venue. He implemented many place-making projects and also envisioned Singapore as a global tourism capital. So Chin Nam, can you share with us your experience in turning tourism concepts into reality, especially the vision of Singapore as a tourism city, Tourism 21, New Asia Singapore, and Singapore as a global tourism capital. Chino.
Well, thank you, Lim. I was posted to STB in 1994, and I served as the CE, Chief Executive, for 3 years. In fact, that was my shortest stint in all my public sector postings. Thanks to Pam and colleagues before me, I think they had provided me and my colleagues with a very strong foundation to build on. So what is required is really to build on this foundation and to evolve a second S-curve of growth. And therefore, we work on this project called Tourism 21, which is really a very exciting paradigm-shifting project because it envisages Singapore as a global tourism capital, comprising 3 elements. Because normally when we talk about tourist promotion, it's always about Singapore as an exciting tourist destination. So the flow is inward, one direction, to come to visit Singapore. But under Tourism 21, which involved the Secretariat support, 50 staff from STB working with 400-500 people over 9 months in order to come up with a new vision. Now this new vision would have 3 elements. Of course, Singapore as a tourist destination. Secondly, Singapore as a tourism business center. I think this particular aspect is particularly important. I'll come back to that later on. And thirdly, Singapore as a tourism hub. So the underlying strategy of Tourism 21 is to look at Singapore as Singapore Unlimited, and therefore Tourism Unlimited. So it has got the tourist arrival dimension, as well as the dimension of tourism as a business, tourism as the serious business. So we envisage Singapore as a place for you to carry out new ideas, to do investment, marketing, to bring in investment, to work together with local entrepreneurs, to encourage local entrepreneurs to embrace this aspect of Singapore as a business center in tourism. So this dimension of bringing Singapore to the world will become an add-on of bringing the world to Singapore, covering the visitorship dimension as well as the tourism business dimension. So we use concept like borrowed scenery. In other words, a beautiful garden can be made more beautiful if you were to integrate the garden landscape together with the distant scenery. This is a Japanese landscaping concept of shake, borrowed scenery. So a small Singapore can become quite big if you are able to leverage new tourism space, working together with partners outside. In other words, we look at not just GDP, but GNP, gross national product. So the whole Tourism 21 plan has got 6 elements. Firstly, redefining tourism. Now this is a very important aspect for us to sell tourism as an important business. After all, it is the largest sector in the world, comprising roughly maybe 10% of the world's GDP, and 1 in 10 people in the world will work in the tourism sector. So tourism as a business would then become a very important aspect of this redefining tourism first strategic thrust of Tourism 21. Secondly, reformulating the product. So we look at tourism as an experiential industry, experiential offering, and therefore it's just important for us to become a business architect, an experienced architect, working with our partners in order to improve the products, in order to reformulate the products, and therefore the positioning of Singapore as New Asia Singapore, which is really a fusion of old and new, modernity and heritage coexisting. I think Raffles Hotel is very much that. And I think you can also look at Fullerton. In fact, Philip Ng would tell people that the whole project was inspired by the New Asia positioning. And to this date, I think many of our very exciting projects, including National Art Gallery, the transformation of City Hall, Supreme Court would also be in this genre, so to speak. Capitol Theatre would also belong to this genre. So, New Asia positioning. Fusion food, for example, World Gourmet Summit, it is an outcome of this New Asia positioning. So, of course, we do need to have events, we have to cover food, shopping, etc., reformulating the product. Third, developing tourism as an industry. Now, this is an area which is very new to STB, because in the past, STB was purely involved in attracting tourists to come to Singapore, the tourism promotion aspect. But with this idea of tourism as a business, as a serious business, we see a lot of very interesting concepts evolving in Singapore. We can be viewed as a lifestyle center, a place where you can try out new ideas, and therefore we have got many products up to this point in time, receiving very good attention overseas. Ascot, Fraser's, Bread Talk, Charles & Keith, and so on and so forth. They would all belong to this category of tourism as a business. Fourth, configuring new tourism space. In other words, we are short of space in Singapore. By working together with our partners, borrowing space from, for example, Bintan, we will be able to make the total offering a lot more exciting. Collective attractiveness, collective competitiveness. So I think this area will continue to evolve. I think for that, we need to have many partners. Fifthly, partnering for success. Now, this is a very aspect of STB as a statutory organization, a board working together with partners according to a 3P approach: public, private, and people partnership. Now, this people partnership is extremely important because tourism is not just for tourists. It is also for Singaporeans. It is about city transformation, making the city more livable, with more choices, more exciting, so that you'll be proud of Singapore, you'll be proud of our heritage and culture. And I think this is an area where I think Lik Peng has done quite well, because he's able to preserve, for example, his latest project, Mee Pok plus Yakitori. Mee Pok hopefully still at $3 plus Yakitori, and he's able to preserve the attractiveness of Tiong Bahru while offering something very exciting to Singaporeans as well as visitors. Sixthly, championing tourism. Now, this is a very important area. The name STBB was changed to STB because we want to embrace this, the new and very exciting future of tourism as a serious business, tourism development as comprising many aspects of making Singapore more livable, more attractive. So I think I will just stop at this point, the 6 elements of Tourism 21, and later on in the conversation I think we could perhaps go into a bit more detail.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chin Nam. So we have you to thank for the term New Asia and fusion food, and probably hear more from Lik Peng later on that. Okay, we'll go on to Neo Chian. Neo Chian is himself a very passionate traveller and has seen through many projects and events that have brought on the wow factor in tourism development in Singapore. His vision of Singapore as a unique tourist destination in itself was implemented by wooing world-class players, partnership with the private sector, but also by engaging local participation. So Neo Chian, can you tell us how you brought in the big-ticket projects and events into Singapore, including drawing interest from international players and engaging Singaporeans to be part of these initiatives? Neo Chian.
Hello. I think that will take about 30 minutes. Yeah, I think I'll take that as a broad topic to address, which is really how do we attract, how do we conceive, attract, and develop major projects. And then within the context, we'll try to deal with those issues that Lim Min's talked about. And if I don't cover it well enough, I think we can touch upon those in the Q&A. I think when we look at these big projects, I think it's important to look at the context in which we undertake those projects, because they are not really undertaken in vacuum, All right, there's a big picture involved, all right, in developing these projects. Back about 10 years ago, time passed really quite fast, 10 years ago. In 2002, when I first joined STB, I think my colleagues and I, we got into some planning, and I think these notions about championing tourism, all right, that Chinan spoke about, I think that came on quite strongly, that our job is really to champion tourism. And then analyzing the data, we also feel that it was important, all right, that we should turn tourism into a key driver for economic growth for Singapore and creating new jobs. All right, because I think you look at the data at the time, as a share of the tourism, as a share of the GDP, tourism was in fact declining. All right, going from a high of maybe at 10% way many years ago to at the time when I joined was around about 3%, but it was declining. So all of us in STB felt that if we want to make tourism as an important sector, then I think we need to make an effort, all right, to reverse the decline, all right, in the share of the GDP. But our work in 2003 was interrupted by SARS. I think some of you in the audience were involved with me and colleagues in combating SARS. That year we saw the VA drop to, the visitors arrival drop to 6 million. And at some point in the month of April and May, I think you'll recall that tourism, actually for that matter Singapore, practically came to a standstill. You would go to the hotel, there were occupancy of less than 10%. Okay, and we held an event in Changi Airport with DPM, Lee Hsien Loong there at the time. You know, we especially do in airport because we wanted to emphasize the importance of tourism, you know, and we brought the whole tourism sector there for a SARS event, and the airport was empty. So I think resulting from SARS, there's a realization, all right, of the importance of tourism, all right, to the Singapore economic sector, that many jobs actually depend on tourism. Not just those people directly working in the sector itself, like Loh Lik Peng, or like those in the travel industry. I think PM highlighted his contact with a cab driver in his rally speech, how the cab driver was in fact badly affected by SARS. I think this particular very unfortunate episode of SARS, although affected many people, but on the flip side of it, I think it generated a certain awareness of the importance of the tourism sector. And I think a greater awareness there's a need for a new roadmap for tourism or to try to revitalize it. So in 2004, we crafted the Tourism 2015 roadmap in consultations with the industry partners. In this roadmap, we set the target of doubling our visitors' arrival to 17 million and tripling our tourism receipt to 30 billion, and then creating 100,000 new jobs. And then to support this roadmap, we asked the government to allocate $2 billion fund, you know, to set up the Tourism Development Fund. And I think it's also important point to point out that when we set these targets, we were actually quite mindful about not just number, but also to improve the yield. And that's the reason why you find that we were wanting to triple the tourism receipt, even though we were only going for doubling the visitors' arrival. The roadmap was launched by Minister Lim Neo Chian in January 2005. Now, in this plan, one can look at it a little bit like how one develop a tourism attraction. And capacity planning is actually a very important part of what we do as a tourism organization to ensure that when we market, when we push for new products, we're in a position to handle, all right, the increased number of visitors. So if you look at it this way, under our Tourism 2015 roadmap plan, and you work through the numbers, you will realize that we have to handle 170,000 tourists each day. 170,000 tourists each day by 2015. All right, if we succeed in our tourism 2015 roadmap. And this go from about 70,000 tourists each day in 2004. So there's this incremental capacity, all right, that we need to build about 100,000 tourists each day. And that what it means is that you need to create a destination that allows us to handle this 107,000 in order to accommodate them, to service them, to entertain them, and find new things to do for this extra number of visitors. 10 years ago, when you look at Singapore, although we were improving as a tourist destination, but really, we are really more a business city. And some of us may be aware that our weekend occupancy for hotel is generally weaker, all right, than the weekday, all right, really because the businessmen go back home, all right, for their own weekend. And that's a sort of a sign that we're a little bit more like a business city than a leisure. So as part of our Tourism 2015 roadmap, our goal is really to entrench our position as a business city. We're already very good at what we're doing. We want to make sure that we continue to do well. And yet at the same time, we want to develop Singapore as a leisure destination, or to provide the fun element. At the same time, also to support the position that we're actually a service center of the region. So when I mean services, I'm referring to things like healthcare, banking, or maybe education. So that's really sort of our vision, all right, to ensure that we entrench MICE, all right, we develop Singapore as a leisure destination, as a services center of the region. We also recognize that actually all these areas that we are hoping to develop are actually very much mutually dependent. For example, if you want to further grow the MICE sector, I think you can't ignore, all right, that you actually have to develop the leisure or the fun dimension of the destination. Because at the end of the day, I think any MICE planner would really want to avoid having to bring an event to a city that's considered boring, where after the meeting there's nothing much to do. So they are very much actually intertwined. You want to grow the MICE and you want the big ambitions, or you really ought to have Singapore as also a strong leisure and fun destination. So the long and short is that under the 2015 roadmap, we really want Singapore not just to be known as clean, efficient, and safe. All right, we want Singapore to also be fun and vibrant as well. I'm watching the numbers. Oh, very quick one on the major projects. I was asked to touch briefly on the IRs and the F1 project. Now, on the IR projects, just to reinforce the point that in the case of Marina Bay, it was really about MICE. So when we conceived the IR project in Marina, MICE was uppermost in our mind. And we told our bidders that we are looking for a compelling MICE precinct in the heart of the city, all right, in Marina Bay. And around Marina Bay, we envision the doubling of MICE space to 200,000 square meters and doubling the number of hotel rooms to 10,000 hotel rooms, all located within easy walking distance. And this is important because when you hold major MICE event, where a number of delegates go to thousands, you want to be able to have it very conveniently executed without too much of logistic problems. In the case of Sentosa IR, the concept was really about developing Singapore as a family leisure destination. In the case of F1, it was really about, largely a branding exercise. We went out to essentially change the image of Singapore, all right, that we are boring. All right, and I think by having F1, I think we succeeded in changing the image. And in one single act, I think the world out there realized that Singapore is no longer boring and that we're always prepared to try new ideas and to change things. Today, the Singapore F1 race is still the only night race in the calendar. And I still recall the day after September the 28th, 2008. That was the first event that we held for F1. The major newspaper around the world have pictures of the Singapore F1 on the front page. I think this is something that even if you're willing to spend the money to buy that publicity mileage, I think it will be very, very hard to get by unless we have done this F1 event. In the words of Bernie Ecclestone, the owner of the F1 project, F1 event, he says that through the hosting of the event, Singapore is now a jewel in the F1 crown. Now, in the interest of time, I was supposed to cover some areas about how we actually go about bringing this event. I will leave out the details, but just to mention 4 points. There are 4 key success factors in running this event. First point is really, before you embark on the event, I think it is important that we are clear on the outcome of the project that you're seeking. Okay. It's important because unless you're clear on outcome, you cannot align all the different agencies involved in the project. You cannot align the people who may be bidding for the project. So it was very clear that we undertake this big project. We put a lot of thoughts in thinking about what kind of outcome that we want. So I explained earlier, some were for mine, some were for family destinations, some were really about branding. So I think here a lesson to do is if you undertake any project, big or small, especially a big project, I think it's important to think about what is the outcome that you desire. Second is that for big projects, the whole government approach is indispensable. Because many of us here involved in this big event, you'll realize that practically every government agencies has to come in to support the project. Whether is it MND, URA, particularly so in the case of IR projects, and then in the case of F1, practically every department in the governments are involved in staging this project. Without good alignment and without everybody chipping in, looking at it as a whole government approach, this project will not be possible to conduct. Third is really about a strong process. Now, at the end of the day, this project is not just bringing about a product that we want. It's also about ensuring that as we do it, Singapore reputation is enhanced and not diminished. Because you don't handle the process properly, if you lack integrity, you lack transparency, you lack level playing field, you don't, if you do it in a way that people don't see that you have been fair to everybody, then in fact, rather than getting a product you want, your reputation gets diminished. So we put a lot of thoughts in developing the process, not alone, but with all different government agencies, to ensure that you will be a process that will be fair and transparent with integrity. So that in the end, we not just get the outcome we want, but people start to believe, and even believe more so about the reputation of Singapore. And lastly, is really about getting public support. I think all this project is not possible unless you really got the public on board. So a fair amount of time was spent really going about getting public support, PR, for the IR projects on the F1. Okay, so these are 4 key success factors in my view that are important to keep in mind when you do all these major projects. I think on balance, looking at the outcome and the recent tourism numbers that we've been looking at, I think on the whole, I think the major projects that were undertaken is not just helping us getting out of the crisis in 2008-09, but I think it's also helping us to get nearer to the 2015 tourism target that we set some 10 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Neo Chian, for reminding us that tourism is very serious business, but also that we have to have fun. And I think we have you to thank for bar-top dancing coming back, right? Okay, which brings me to Lik Peng. Lik Peng is an award-winning restaurateur and hotelier. He really is a taste maker, and through his experience overseas, has brought novel hospitality concepts that have set new benchmarks in Singapore, such as introducing cool places to eat and stay within heritage districts, as well as in new places like Gardens by the Bay. So Lik Peng, please share with us the private sector perspective to tourism developments in Singapore, and how you see the relationship between tourism and heritage, and don't forget to tell us about the mee pok and the yakitori too.
Yeah, actually, I came into the tourism space by accident. I started out as a lawyer, I followed the typical Singapore path. My parents said, hey, you got to be a profession. They were both doctors. So, I didn't want to study medicine. I actually got into medical school, and within a week I switched, and I actually wanted to study history. My parents were like, no, you gotta pursue a profession. So I ended up pursuing law, and I came back to Singapore to practice law at that kind of tail end of the last Asian crisis. Is kind of when I entered the profession. It was around 97, 98, And at the time in Singapore, as a young practitioner, a lot of the cases we were doing was, literally just bankrupting people and doing winding up petitions. And I was the generation who grew up with Ally McBeal, and it was nothing like that. So, I quickly grew quite disillusioned with practice. I think within 3-4 years, I was like, oh man, this is really not what I was looking for work, And at the time, Singapore was still kind of pulling itself out of the last Asian crisis. There were a lot of, as a practitioner of law, I could see a lot of kind of, banks doing mortgagee auctions and things like that. And you can see these properties that, like 2-3 years ago were valued at 10 million, were going for 2 or 3 million, literally less than half the price, And it was that sort of environment where there was no confidence in the market, contractors didn't have work. It was a difficult kind of time in Singapore's thing. But at the same time, as a practitioner, I could see kind of these opportunities there. All the time I was coming across this kind of sheets of Knight Frank. They sent it to us because we had to do make sure all the boxes were ticked by the banks before they went on auction. And I was like, wow, it can't really be that they're selling something like this, which, 3-4 years ago, the valuation was 10 million. Now, go to auction and value is 3 million. So at the time, I was looking, wow, all these different, particularly in kind of Chinatown, a lot of these shop houses. And so it occurred to me, well, that's kind of an opportunity to come in. And it happened at the time, Keong Siak Road, there were a few properties there. I noticed this one that used to be called the Regal Inn. It was basically an hourly rate hotel. The bank had foreclosed on it about a year before that, and gone on auction 3 or 4 times, and nobody took it up. So at the time, I thought I'll take a year out of practice and see whether I'd try my hand at being a hotelier. Because I'd come from overseas, I'd studied overseas, and I noticed there were a lot of boutique hotels in Singapore. I mean, outside of in Europe and stuff, and none in Singapore. And at the time, I thought maybe this would be an interesting thing to do, and I thought I'd take a year sabbatical and do it. And so I made an offer for that building, and a very ridiculous offer in hindsight. And the bank gave it to me, and so that's how really 1929 came along. At the time, I was a complete novice. I was, and I told my parents, and they're like, Keong Siak Road, because it was still a red light area of Singapore. It's not anywhere like what it is now. And I think in my kind of naivety, I didn't really think too hard about it. I said, well, whatever. You go to Soho in London, it's a red light area, but there's so many exciting places there, or Montmartre in Paris. So at that time, I think in a way my ignorance was good. This building was fabulous. I thought architecture was great, and I worked with I had no budget at the time. I worked with the architect, and and that's really how kind of 1929 came along. 2003 we opened in the midst of SARS. We opened a month before SARS, so there was a huge lesson for me. But in hindsight, that was the most valuable lesson, because really kind of taught me a lot of lessons I would not have learned had we opened with kind of full house, because at the time you really kind of make sure your whole team bonds together, and you guys think of new ways to people and make yourself known. And given that I didn't have a background in hotels, and my team were all kind of pretty green, we came up with all sorts of kind of crazy ideas about promotions and things like that, which stood us in very good stead later on. But at the time, we were the first kind of boutique hotel in kind of a conservation area. So we had an interesting story to tell, and the press really picked up on it. So despite it being in the middle of SARS, actually we did reasonably well, because we had a lot of Singaporeans staying with us, because they were intrigued with this idea of a boutique hotel with all this vintage furniture and with a really cool restaurant in Keong Siak Road. I think at that time a lot of my guests would literally, the ladies would come up to me and say, hey, I got accosted on the way to the hotel by someone offering me to to buy me. And that's really how that's really how the street was at that time. But that hotel really gave me a spark about, wow, this is an interesting area to be in. Singapore has all these fabulous buildings in Chinatown, Little India. And the hotels that were there at the time were all doing hourly rates. Nobody was trying to do anything interesting. Nobody kind of set out the stall and say, we're going to try and do a quality product. So I thought there was a little bit of gap in the market. But, at the time when I engaged agencies, STB, URA about doing projects. Even then, a lot of them were doubtful because they couldn't quite believe that someone wanted to do a hotel in Keong Siak Road and not charge hourly rates, So, but after that happened, our next project, New Majestic, again, another mortgagee sale down the street, Bukit Pasoh. And these were, at that time, relatively quiet streets in Chinatown. It didn't really have any kind of life in them. A lot of them were old clan associations. A lot of the buildings were shuttered, in fact. Apart from a few eateries, there wasn't much there. So it was just that magic moment in time when there were a lot of opportunities, and I was lucky enough to pick those two. And when I did New Majestic, obviously a lot of lessons learned from 1929. I wasn't that green anymore. Our team was a little bit more mature. We started to look at a different type of boutique hotel, something a little bit more high-end. Because actually when I launched 1929, it was still meant to be quite a budget kind of hotel, but the problem with the perception when you put design in front of a hotel, everyone thinks it's going to be a luxury product. So a lot of people came into the hotel thinking wow, we're going to stay in a luxury hotel, and actually we weren't. 1929 is very small rooms, and so the rates kind of reflected that. But when we did New Majestic, we did a very luxurious product. The rooms were quite large. We have 30 rooms in there, and New Majestic is maybe 2.5 times the size of 1929, and we were able to put a swimming pool, things like that. And again, when we launched that, it really kind of set a benchmark in terms of rates and the type of product we were doing in a heritage building, and also in that at that time, very quiet part of Chinatown, and at the same time, we got this massive reception. The international press picked it up. We won a lot of awards overseas with that hotel, and suddenly, I could see the changes coming out in the street. You could see different boutiques opening up, restaurants, and if you go to Keong Siak Road or Bukit Pasoh now, of course, it's a very vibrant street. Property prices have quadrupled. I can't buy anything there now. And so it occurred to me then that these were successful products, and funnily enough, I brought that philosophy overseas when I started doing my hotels overseas. It wasn't so much that I kind of brought heritage overseas to Singapore, in that I learned those lessons in Singapore. So when I did my first hotels overseas, again, I always looked at different neighborhoods, slightly off the beaten track, because they were always going to be cheaper, And I always looked for really interesting buildings with a lot of character, buildings with very strong heritage elements. So in London, we had Town Hall Hotel, which was the former Town Hall of Bethnal Green. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Bethnal Green, but it's the east end of London, and up to, a few years ago, was a really rough neighborhood. So I picked up this old town hall, really, for London prices, pretty cheap. And this was before the Olympics kind of story came about, So again, it was really following the model I did in Singapore. And again, Shanghai, in the South Bund. And it's right by the water, and it's maybe 200 meters from the Bund. But at that time, it was the old docks of Shanghai. When we first opened, we were the only business there, and the taxis couldn't find it. So, but if you go there now, it's a really vibrant neighborhood. Again, so, we've always been able to find interesting buildings in neighborhoods that we thought had potential, because the connectivity was good, but maybe a little bit overlooked, and that's really kind of how we've kind of really pursued that model. We've always looked for heritage buildings. It's still very much part of the DNA of our group, And we're doing a project in Sydney now. Again, it's kind of on the Broadway of Sydney, but it's the old Carlton United Brewery site. It was the old headquarters. A very unloved old brick building, 100-year-old brick building. But when you look at it from the outside, it looks a bit rough, because it was built as a part of a brewery, so it's a very rough industrial thing. But I kind of love those type of buildings, because you can never quite replicate the age and the heritage of an old building. And again, we're going to try something different there in terms of the rooms. We're going to try and reflect the neighborhood. And often when people come to stay in my hotels overseas, they always say to me, hey, you could never tell that a Singaporean has done this project. And I always say, yeah, that's correct, because we never try and import anything Singaporean to it. We work with local architects, we work with local designers, we try and incorporate as much of local neighborhood elements as we can, so that it really reflects its neighborhood, its heritage, rather than say, well, why don't you bring a Singapore architect overseas? I always try and kind of work with local guys there and try and incorporate really kind of the spirit of the place. And I always feel that, these kind of projects become successful because the neighbors accept that you're doing something authentic there, and in keeping with the heritage. And I think that's very important when you work with heritage buildings to try and keep that spirit of the place. I think my time is over, so I'll elaborate further.
So I haven't heard anything about the mee pok though, but
Yeah,
never
well,
mind, you
okay.
get a chance to talk about it. So I think we appreciate very much the idea of bringing in the local rather than importing ideas from overseas. So that's a very critical difference in what you do. We've come to the segment of the discussion where we will actually dwell on some of the common themes and ideas that some of you have already shared with us a little bit. I think what is very unique in Singapore's approach is really this very integrated approach between planning and development, both for tourism and urban development. Pamelia, you yourself saw very large-scale tourism development strategies that need the support of various agencies to be integrated within the urban development projects. Chin Nam, you work very closely with EDB, as well as the arts and cultural sectors in your tourism development plans. And Neo Chian, as we said earlier on, these big ticket items and events needed a very integrated approach in order to achieve the impacts that you envisaged. And Lik Peng, you work literally within the nexus of urban development, tourism, and enterprise to bring your concepts into fruition. So maybe, I'll throw it to the panelists to discuss this topic and from your personal perspective and how you see this.
Well, I actually have had the pleasure of working with a few different kind of tourism authorities because we've worked overseas as well as Singapore, and it always strikes me that, the countries like Singapore do have a much more integrated approach, and they are much smarter about how they kind of do their tourism. I think mainly because Singapore is a small country, and in a sense, if we don't do these initiatives from a government point of view, there's very little traction that you can get, particularly with the fragmented kind of private sector players. Whereas if we go to somewhere like New South Wales in Australia, they're also very activist. Again, because they're in the middle of nowhere, and if they don't make enough noise, nobody's going to go there. Whereas if you go to somewhere like Shanghai, actually the tourism authority there is pretty much, very passive because in a sense they don't really care about tourism that much because for them it's a large country with a lot of interest. They have a huge domestic kind of population. And you talk about tourism to them, they think they're so big that people should come to them. They never think about, doing festivals and stuff. You never hear of the tourism authority doing those initiatives in China. They don't really give a damn. Whereas in Singapore, all the time you talk to STB, they're thinking of new ways to do things. So for me, this whole government approach has always been one of Singapore's key success. At SHA level, which I sit on the board at, we continually engage all the government agencies, and to be honest, Singapore is probably one of the best.
I agree.
I think this need to have an integrated approach is because of the multi-dimensional nature of the tourism industry. Yeah? It cuts across all sectors. Just now I spoke about the GDP contribution of tourism as 10%. This is according to the World Travel and Tourism Council. But when you look at the direct contribution, it's only about 3%. So the indirect contribution is very huge because it cuts across so many different sectors, and therefore it is important to adopt this total systems approach, which I think is, in a way, our competitive advantage. And the STB, whether it is Tourism 21 or Tourism 2015, the approach is always to start with a compelling vision. With that vision, then I think people will be aligned internally as well as externally. But the stakeholders' involvement is absolutely crucial. So I think you need to do a lot of communication in order to achieve the buy-in. Otherwise, I think a project like integrated resorts is not possible. But a spin-off is fantastic. IR is actually a very creative use of term. I think Pamelia mentioned about casino. in Singapore, we don't talk about casino, right? But I do have this favorite way of looking at the impact of IR. BC and AC. Before casino and after casino. Well, Singapore has been totally transformed in terms of its experiential offering, in terms of also property prices, etc. So I think the economic spin-off is huge, arising from this multi-dimensional approach in evolving the tourism industry. And this is also linked to the attractiveness of the city, livability of the city. So I think in that sense, it is absolutely crucial to adopt a total systems approach.
At STB, when I was there, many of you still in STB. We like to tell ourselves that we could accomplish, a lot more working with different government agencies than try to do everything on our own. Okay, and that's really something that's a simple idea, but when it comes to execution, it's not always so easy. But if you look at different areas, then you start to realize that actually there's a lot of synergy in what the different government agencies want to do. All right, that in fact, if we make an effort to work with them, it will help them in doing what they are doing, and that in turn, helps us accomplish what we want to do in tourism. So in a sense, when you multiply out, actually the impact is actually many times over. All right, when we try to work with all the different government agencies. So in the case of MICE, for example, it's very clear that you need to work with the champions of the industry clusters. Right? And we know for a long time, government has paid a lot of attention, and resources, on research or biomedical industry, and that's championed by A-Star and EDB. And then you've got the banking industry, which obviously MOF and MAS. And you look at different industry classes, transport and whatever, they are industry champions. So we decided as part of our MICE strategy, that we need to work with these champions. And by helping them, and we helping to help bring about events, and we can bring about events, in fact, they help them also in developing their clusters. Then we work with, MND when they were working on the Gardens by the Bay. And from STB point of view, we were quite happy to support Gardens by the Bay because, it was quite clear to us it's going to be a very compelling tourism attraction, not just serving Singaporeans alone. And then you have the Singapore Garden Festival. Again, we are happily supporting it because now what happened? We actually got MPARK, right, championing tourism and helping, with the new products for tourism. Same thing, we work closely with Singapore Sport Council on some of the sports events. Again, then we got Sport Council helping to push tourism. And then we have got MND when it comes to events like City Summit, Global Summit, City Summit. Again, there's another event that we got another agency helping to push that. So I think if we take this approach and pursue it with intensity, I think there's a lot more we can accomplish, as a whole government, rather than STB on its own. Thank you.
Well, I can tell you about the early days. During the early days, Tourism Board was considered a rich relative with not much up there. And the reason being we had the cess money and we could spend on things that others would find difficulty spending on. So I have two men that I credit for this new way of working. One was Mr. Ngiam Tong Dao, who was a permanent secretary of Ministry of Trade and Industry. And he said to me, what do you need? I said, I know what I need. I can give you a whole list. And that ended up as the 1 billion tourism development plan, which led to the conservation of all the historic areas, Bugis Street, Singapore River, as well as Raffles Hotel, as well as other things. And so Mr. Ngiam was a very clever PermSec because he was PermSec finance as well as trade and industry. So he would chair the meetings himself. And when Mr. Ngiam chairs a meeting as permanent secretary, everybody sent very senior people. They didn't send their junior officers. So right away at these very few meetings, big decisions could be made. The second person I credit is Mr. Lim Neo Chian, who's then the chairman of Tourist Board. So after we got this plan, he said to me, what do you need to do conservation? He said, you lead a government delegation to go overseas to study conservation. And he was very clever because it meant that the building code people have to change their rules because conservation of old buildings cannot fit in to new codes. So we invited the fire department. We invited building control. We invited all the people that would give us trouble. And so this is why I said they were very clever people. And this is how a tourism board got a place at the table.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to expand this idea about the common themes. Another common theme that I got from what you said, especially Pamelia's various trips abroad, whether or not it was approved by her bosses, was that we learned a lot from others. You went to many cities, look at place-making experiences, and brought in many international experts such as Didier Rapon to help with conservation, and Louis Clark with our lighting master plan. Chin Nam, you test-bedded many new tourism products in Singapore, engaging world-class retailers and convention experts. And Neo Chian, of course, you brought in world-class players through the integrated resorts developments and F1 events. Lik Peng, you spent a lot of time in the UK and have developed hospitality projects in Europe. And you brought in many Michelin star chefs for your projects in Singapore. So to what extent do we learn from others, but at the same time develop a unique tourism industry in Singapore? Maybe you can share that with us.
Right.
Sure.
Well, first of all, many of the governments were very clever. As soon as they knew that we were interested in doing conservation, they came knocking on our door. And the first people were the French. And they had budgets to help us. And they would come to us and say, what do you need? And I said, well, I don't want you to send me your consultant. I could imagine whose turn is next would come. I said, no, we want to choose our consultants. They said, that's fine. You choose whoever consultant you want. So the French were very quick in reacting and helping us. And of course, within 24 hours of us nominating the consultant that we wanted the French government to bring, everyone in the French building industry involved in conservation knew he was coming to Singapore. And that is doing business with a finesse. In other words, the French do it with style, and they know how to do it so that they didn't end up with very good business. But everybody did get a formal approval for the trip, by the way. So that was where we got the earlier help. And we did look at other countries to see, but I must admit the French were way advanced when it came to lighting. And following government system, we had to call tender for everything. And they fit, until Louis Clare keeps telling me the story that he had to mortgage his house because he had to give a guarantee to bid for Singapore's tender.
I think it is extremely important for us to adopt a learning strategy. Organization as a learning organization, Singapore as a learning nation. We can learn so much from overseas. Let's take the case of Sentosa Cove, for example. I think with the input provided by Pamelia, because I think you were the first to have gone to Port Grimaud to take a look at how to bring about waterfront living environment. And I think that kind of a learning strategy would continue in many of the things that we do. So today, if you were to go to Sentosa Cove, particularly the quayside, I think the environment is extremely conducive. You can have alfresco dining. And guess what? Alfresco dining started in Boat Quay. And that was an intervention by STBB at that point in time. And that has stretched to Clarke Quay, a major redevelopment, Robertson Quay, and so on and so forth. And including the Dempsey accidental development, which is still evolving. So I think STB has created a lot of local interpretation of initiatives, including alfresco dining. That's not to say that we have not been doing al fresco Singapore style, right? Zi cha in Singapore, it's always al fresco. But I think the new interpretation of fusion of modernity and heritage would offer a very unique experience to diners. So I think this strategy will continue, and I think successful organizations will want to learn from the world. And what's important is that there must be a local receptacle. What is learned will have to be translated into local actions. For the Tourism Development Assistance Program, local industry upgrading program, we've got a lot of initiatives by Spring, by EDB, by IE Singapore, working with tourism enterprises in order to make Singapore a tourism business center. So learning is a very important strategy.
Well, I personally find many of these study trips that we make overseas very, very useful. So each time we have a major project that we are thinking of, we will put together all the different parties on some study trip, and you map out the plan or where to go and visit, what to see, a question to ask. I think along the line that what Pam was talking about. So people who might have an issue on some of the issues, I think it's good to bring them in early so that when you go on a study trip, you'll learn from the foreign government or foreign operator, but you also use the study trip to address some of the issues. And there are, when you go on a study trips, there are lots of opportunity for you to talk about different issues, because you have your dinner together, you go to the airport, you wait in the lounge together for the flights to come. There are so many opportunities where all the different agencies has chance to keep talking about the issues that you are on the trip for, right? And so by the time you come back, and after a few of such trips, you actually find that the different agencies are already very much aligned, in terms of what needs to be done. After learning, from, the partners overseas. And obviously in our approach to things, we learn, but we also make it a point, to see what is applicable to us and to develop something that's unique, to do even better than what the other people are doing. Okay, we do that for the IRs, we did that for the F1, we did that for the cruise terminal that we were planning and developing at one point. So in many of these projects, that's what we do, and I will strongly advocate this approach be taken for any major projects that we do. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I realized early on is, the world is very small now, In a sense, everyone travels everywhere. You are so connected. Singapore it's an island, but it's a very small island, but, we have so many influences from throughout the world. And in a way, that's been something that Singapore has been able to leverage on very well, because given our small size and our limited, not that limited offerings anymore, but, I just give you an example, dining scene, for example. If you look at something like Restaurant Andre, which is the #1 restaurant in Singapore when you look at the 50 best in the world. And, it's only a 3-year-old restaurant. And you speak to any foodie in the world now, they know about it, And in a way, the success of Singapore's dining scene has also brought about the 50 best Asia now, And these are headline-grabbing events, And without kind of the influence of outside chefs, when people like Jason Atherton come to town, or Wak Yu Jin, or Andre, these are all foreign talents. These are all people who have brought different skills from throughout the world and set up in Singapore. And they cater not just to tourists, they cater to Singaporeans, but it lends a different flavor to Singapore. And without those kind of global influences, Singapore will be a much less interesting place. And I think when all of us travel abroad, we look for new experiences. We don't just say, can I go find this nearest Singapore restaurant, So at the same time, we absorb all these differences and different cultures. We come back, we reflect all those kind of travels too. So, I always find it very enriching when I travel, and I make it a point to seek out, unusual cuisines and unusual places and new experiences. And I think that's one thing that Singapore has done very well. We are a very, very connected city. And, you speak to anyone overseas, any chefs, they admire Singapore's food scene a lot, And you talk to anyone in New York, chefs in New York and San Francisco, they are very aware of what's happening in Singapore, our food scene, the kind of openings, and our very sophisticated offering. For for what is, after all, actually still a relatively small city in a far-off place, you know. So I think we have a lot to be proud of from that kind of globalization.
I think I'd like to add that learning should be bi-directional. Now, the whole idea behind the establishment of the World Gourmet Summit was in terms of bringing the world chefs to Singapore and then to have them to work with local chefs. So there will be a lot of fusion, a lot of exchange, to the extent that right now we even have, for example, Gordon Ramsay coming to Singapore to learn how to cook chili crab.
But he lost.
No, he won.
He lost chicken rice.
Chili crab, he won, but then laksa, he lost.
And chicken rice also.
And world-class chefs like Tatsuya, when they come to Singapore, what do they do? What do they eat? Certainly not a 3-star Michelin food. They go to a hawker center. For example, Newton. Tatsuya likes to go there for his dinner. So I think there's a lot of exchange of views, etc. And as a result, when they go back to London and New York, etc., they will also be able to incorporate certain local elements. So this is the whole idea of the fusion, New Asia cuisine, and so on.
This is also your idea of bringing Singapore to the world, because if you go to many cities in the world now, you can actually find Singapore chicken rice and local Singapore food. So I think it's like all of you have been saying, it's a kind of very good exchange.
I think we should not allow Lik Peng to get away without answering the question on the coexistence of mipo and yakitori. Yes. I mean, mipo $3 is a world of difference from Andre.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, you know what? That happy coincidence came about because when we took over the space at Huabi, we were conscious that there was a lot of talk about the fact that a lot of these heritage eateries were kind of disappearing, particularly in places like Tiong Bahru, where that particular mee pok store was a 3-generation mee pok store. Been there since the 50s. So, we spoke to the Residents Association, and they said to us, hey, these things are important to the residents. And we, at the time, whenever we go to a place, we want to feel welcome. We want to set up a business that locals want to go to. So we looked at it and said, hey, there's no reason why we can't coexist. Because if you look at the operating hours of the mee pok stall, for example, she serves breakfast and lunch. So the kind of restaurants we do, we are primarily dinner. We do some lunch, but it may not be a big part of our kind of business plan. So, I think these are ways in Singapore of tackling some of these issues with very high rentals, because she'd never be able to afford the rental on her own. And let's face it, these private landlords are not going to preserve heritage at their own expense, So I think increasingly in Singapore we're going to see a lot more of these sort of foreign concepts with local concepts, maybe a cheaper price point. She's going to continue selling her mee pok at $3 because basically we're going to bring her in there and she's got the same deal as her grandfather had when she was running the store. I think it was $800 a month or something, which is actually cheaper than what she'll get in a hawker center. And of course she's got, tons of local clientele. She's so I think it's one of those instances where perhaps we can integrate a lot of the kind of Singapore heritage to also the new things that are coming in.
Yeah, I hope that all enterprises think like you, to be able to integrate the existing ecosystem of, food culture with the new ones that are coming in and still have $3 food available next to the very expensive restaurants that you bring in.
They're not all expensive.
Most of them are. I can't afford. Yeah.
I got to bring you for lunch.
Yeah. Okay? He promised. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to this next topic, which I think many of you also touched on, which is really also why we're all sitting here today in this composition. So our close collaboration between public and private sectors. So for Pamelia, you worked on projects such as Raffles Hotel, Fort Canning, the conservation districts where you work very closely with the private sector. Chin Nam, you, in order to build Singapore into a global convention center and place-making efforts such as Chinatown and Chimes, you actually work very closely with private enterprises. Neo Chian's ideas for developing iconic places using events and strategies in creating buzz for Singapore required not just working with business, but also engaging Singaporeans. So here's the chance to tell us more about this. Lik Peng, you work closely with the public sector, so with virtually these people sitting on stage with you. And your projects are often cited in conservation districts. So much so that we just discussed that Tanjung Pagar is now your hood, right? So, how do you see this collaboration continuing, and if it's unique to Singapore?
Well, in tourism, I mean, obviously, it's the private sector. All right, they actually bring in the tourists. Although in the market, we work very closely with them when it comes to marketing, campaign, advertisements, and others. But in the main, it's the private sector that really brings in the tourists, house them, service them, entertain them, and make them happy, before they leave. So I think the private sector is a very important part. So the way I see it is that the collaboration between STB, which, in the industry you call it the NTO, the National Tourism Organization, is really to make sure that we work hand in hand with each other to help them do their job. Because at the end of the day, the private sector has to deliver the experience. But to do that, the private sector will need to be strongly supported by effective NTOs. So I think from that point of view is we have to do what we can or to be effective in supporting, but recognizing that we need to do that well to ensure that they get a job done. And to do that, it's important that you have the vision, all right, so that all of us are aligned, all right, so that we can work effectively in a very synergistic way with the private sector. And I think there are many areas that the private sector will look to the government for support, especially dealing with red tapes and dealing with, in some areas, some financial support, some funding support to make the events or to make a project viable. And thereafter, in marketing, again, I think we play a role in a big way in our market, all right, to help to market Singapore as a destination and also to push some of the new projects that come on stream. So the long and short is that we work very closely with with the private sector. And I think in the course of doing it, you develop the relationship that enable us to work even better together. I would say that in my experience, or at least in my tour, the SARS period actually helps a great deal, or at least personally from my point of view, to develop the relationship and the strong bonds, with many of the key players in the private sector. When you go through a crisis together, I think it breaks down many of the barriers. And subsequently thereafter, it was so much easier, working hand in hand with many of the private sector in pushing different initiatives. And arising from SARS, we actually formed a tourism consultative council, which was meeting once a quarter. And thereafter, we slowed down a little bit, maybe like 2 to 3 times a year. I'm not sure if it's still ongoing. But I found that particular council very useful, all right, because it provides the avenue and the occasions, for the industry to come together. In fact, all elements of the industry coming together, for them just to voice the issue and say what is in their mind, thinking ahead what might be some of the issues. So collectively as a sector, we have the occasions to look ahead, deal with some of the issues, before they actually get to become difficult for the industry. So that's how during my tenure I found useful in dealing with some of the industry government issues. Thank you.
I think the idea of co-creation of a vision is important, co-visioning. But when it comes to implementation, I think the collaboration can happen at 2 levels. Of course, I think government agencies, including STB, will be happy to help individual companies to grow, to become big, and to respond to all sorts of initiatives. But I think at the industry level, this is where the consultative council is important, or national marketing council, etc., that kind of mechanism. And when it comes to thematic development, let's say developing Chinatown or Singapore River Walk, etc., you do need to involve the stakeholders. So there will have to be a mechanism created through some sort of a stakeholder association, or in US, of course, they have the Main Street Committee. So the committee will interact with government agencies, and in this case, STB, in order to see how the stakeholders collectively will be able to respond to the challenge of the vision. I think in the case of Mipo, I understand that you were sort of approached by the Residents Association. So they have been very proactive in wanting to preserve the heritage of Tiong Bahru, $3 Mipo. So I think that this sort of stakeholder involvement is very, very crucial in order to bring about the ideal of government, or the public, the private, as well as the people sectors working together in order to be aligned to realize the vision.
Speaking as a private sector player, obviously, we are conscious of the fact that somewhere like Singapore, a small city-state, events like F1 and all that would never happen without, government kind of agencies championing it and kind of really putting the whole thing together. Because, when you have a very large, complex event, even things like, the air show in Singapore, things like that, all these large events in Singapore without where the private sector is very involved, but without the facilitator of the government, these events just wouldn't happen. So I think, particularly kind of in Singapore's case, where we're a small island state, where resources really have to be shared. You've got to use the public road for F1 as well as, for transporting Singaporeans to work, things like that. You can't make it happen in Singapore without government agencies kind of getting together and saying, hey, this is something worthwhile doing. It's the same with land allocation for IR and things like that. There's so many competing interests in Singapore. And when we, as an association, SHA, go and speak to government, then you kind of have a much better appreciation, because often they'll tell you, well, there's this kind of constraint, that constraint, which in the private sector we don't always see, because we maybe perhaps look at it from, one sector's point of view. But when you engage government and you kind of have different views, and you realize in Singapore's context, with a small island state and many, many, many competing interests for the same tax dollar, the same space, the same kind of land, I think in Singapore particularly, it's almost indispensable to kind of get government participation in certainly the larger projects.
I don't know what to say, but I'm thinking to myself that so often in government we say, why? Why do you need this? Why? And I'm saying to myself, actually the officers should be saying, why not? Why not we allow this? Why not we try this? Rather than why don't we use the word why not? Why it cannot be done? And if you can argue through and come up with a strong answer, then you put forth your counter-argument. But I'm thinking working in government is a very onerous responsibility. When you are there, you have so many opportunities, so many things you can do. And later on, when you leave office, you think to yourself, did I do everything that I could have done? And I remember I wrote a farewell card to Liu Tai Ker when he left as head of URA. And I said, when you think back in years to come, you will think of every line you drew and whether you should have drawn more lines or different lines. So as I said, it's a very onerous responsibility when you have the opportunities that working in government enables you.
All right, and I will take your advice. So why not we move on to the next question? From what all of you said this afternoon, it seems that our tourism visions and plans not only built up the tourism sector, but helped us to build a livable city. And Pam, your involvement in conservation districts and the adaptive reuse of old landmark buildings has helped us to create a city that retains a sense of its past. Chin Nam's idea of infusing tourism development with the development of the arts and culture was a way of investing in people and talents, which is a very important aspect of building a livable city. Neo Chian's initiatives, of course, created a lot of vibrant precincts and iconic events, and has created new lifestyle options for Singaporeans and visitors alike. And Lik Peng, being a successful tastemaker, not only allowed you to create tastes for enjoyment, but also brought heritage up front to people who enjoy food, and maybe vice versa for people who enjoy heritage to actually taste new kind of cuisine. So maybe you could elaborate a bit about building a livable city on tourism visions.
Well, I mean, one thing a lot of people don't realize is that, the tourism pie has, the growth, certainly in the last 5 years of the tourism kind of pie has allowed everyone else in Singapore to kind of taste a little bit more of the success of Singapore. I know there's a lot of unhappiness on the ground about, having too many foreigners and things like that. But what a lot of people haven't thought about is the fact that this large kind of tourist arrival and the kind of money they bring with it, and the spending that they do here has also expanded the pie for Singaporeans, because without these tourists coming here, a lot of the variety of restaurants that we have here wouldn't exist. A lot of the variety of shops that we have here wouldn't exist. A lot of people would not set up businesses in Singapore because the market wouldn't be that big. The fact that we have 15 million tourists a year allows Singapore to do a lot more things than if you had half that number. And it's not just jobs, it's also about the kind of people who consume in Singapore, the people who go out. Gardens by the Bay probably will not be viable without tourists here, and that's a facility that Singaporeans use a lot. So I think, we've got to look at tourism as a multi-dimensional thing. It helps the country grow. It kind of produces a lot of facilities that have kind of knock-on benefits for Singaporeans too. And it's not, of course, there are negative things about growth of tourism. The roads get a bit more clogged up. Traffic is bad when the coaches are there. We shouldn't try and kind of sugarcoat that. But the fact is, it brings a lot of wider benefits that maybe a lot of people don't realize, because all they see is the congestion or the MRT, not enough space or whatever, But I do think that that's something that we could do a better job of selling, in the tourism sector, that the wider benefits that it brings to Singaporeans.
Yeah, to add to Lik Peng's comments, which I fully agree, I see tourism really as a catalyst, to developing many things that we would want to do anyway for our country. It provides a context, it provides the resources, it provides also the mechanism to help to bring some about all this happening. Obviously, with the big project coming like IR and F1, that helps us, makes us even in a sense easier. Because big projects bring the kind of tourists and the kind of numbers that makes it easy to bring about some of these different concepts and new ideas. I just want to just give a couple of examples on what we do in SDB in a way that we catalyze some of the ideas that we're doing. For example, I think we spent quite a fair bit of time looking at Orchard Road. Because back about 10 years ago, Orchard Road was, we get lots of tourists going and many Singaporeans going. But it was a little bit run down. And we needed somebody to sort of come along and to see how we can rejuvenate Orchard Road a little bit. Now, we were seeing it from a tourism point of view, that it would have been great if we have a better shopping street. We used to call it the world's greatest shopping street, to service or at least to give the tourists a better experience. But at the back of our mind, we're also quite clear, if we improve Orchard Road, really all Singaporeans get a chance to enjoy. And the figures I give you earlier on illustrate really the sort of the picture. Any one time in Singapore, even though we got 15 million tourists, or even up to 17 million tourists a year, there's only about 170 to 200,000 tourists, any one time in Singapore. Because they all, on the average, stay only about 3.7 days, and a couple of years ago, some stay up to 4 days. So if you factor in all this arithmetic, that's really only the numbers of tourists in Singapore any one time. 170,000, 200,000 tourists. And we got a population of 5 million. So whatever that on the basis of what we're able to do in tourism, all right, whether it's improving Orchard Road or helping the nightclub to expand, or the night spot to expand, or helping the hoteliers and the people running a restaurant to do it more effectively, serving the tourists. In effect, actually, Singaporeans really get to benefit a lot more, all right, because our numbers are simply a lot larger, all right, than the number of tourists that we have in Singapore at any one time. Thank you.
To support this particular point, under Tourism 21, in fact, STB was already working with Universal Studios in order to convince the company to come to Singapore. And we were also ready to allocate land in order to allow this particular development to take place. But when it comes to the final analysis, the company would say that we do not have the critical mass. And therefore, just now I was quoting this perspective of looking at Singapore, BC and AC. So with the integrated resort, it is quite possible for Universal Studio to be successful. And in fact, some people may question the high cost of entering into Universal Studio, but if you were to buy a yearly pass, student pass, that can be very, very cost effective. So in other words, tourism, because of the way in which it will make Singapore attractive, because we want to make the experience of the visitors memorable, and that would also include the quality of life of Singaporeans. By means of this sort of a total approach, I think we are effectively increasing the choices for Singaporeans, enhancing the quality of life for Singaporeans, and to make the city a lot more livable. Of course, I think there are issues to be resolved in terms of congestion, etc. But if we can work together in order to address all these issues, then certainly we will be able to continue to evolve Singapore to make it more and more attractive. And I would say, with all these new developments coming up, including the Changi Airport, which we learned from Schiphol Airport, but right now the Jewel, Terminal 4 and 5 will even be more exciting than Terminal 1, which was an outcome of a learning trip. So I think if we were to continue to develop in this way, I can say you ain't seen nothing yet.
Actually, just to make a point about congestion, tourists actually has got quite different travel patterns, you know, from residents and from population. All right, no tourists want to wake up like 7 a.m., 8 morning a.m., right, get to the MRT line, try to push and compete, you know, with Singaporeans getting to work. You know, many of the tourists will try to wake up at 9, 10, well, that's me at least, 9, 10 o'clock. And then you start your days moving around. So tourists actually has got quite different travel pattern. And in fact, in a sense, complement, you know, the travel requirements of the local population. So really the issue about us in Singapore, perhaps really more the issues about immigration, the number of PRs, residents that we have gone up in numbers over the last 10 years. And just to recap again, all right, that actually the number of tourists in Singapore any one time is not big. It's 170, 200,000 when we reach our targeted number. All right, back 10 years ago was only 70, 80,000 tourists any one time, all right, in Singapore. Thank you.
Well, today I think I must make a bit of a confession, because for many projects, I really did it for Singaporeans and future generations of Singaporeans. But it was a lot easier to say that I'm doing it for tourists. For instance, when you save Chinatown, I could just hear a minister saying to me, "You're saving Chinatown? People don't go to Chinatown. They can go to every supermarket and buy everything from cold storage, has all the goods from China." And then I would have to sit and argue and show numbers. So if I said, "Oh, tourists love Chinatown. They really want to go to Chinatown," that's so much easier.
The way you put it, tourism sounds actually quite subversive. That's an excuse. Yeah, okay. I think this brings us to a very good segue for me to be throwing the discussion to the floor. The format for the Q&A session today, we would like to do it such that we collect about 3 or 4 questions and then we'll throw them at the panelists to see who will bite. But when you ask the question, we would like to also for you to introduce yourself so we know where you're coming from. And I know most of you are from STB, but please do come to the floor, and we'll take the questions now. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not from this industry. Okay. I'm actually from the chemical industry, trying to learn something from tourism industry here. So my question to the panel is, what will be the next big idea for Singapore?
Okay, maybe we'll take a few. Yes.
Yes, Ken Hickson. I'm a sustainability consultant, and I did notice, even though the CSR exists for livable and sustainable cities, I haven't heard the word sustainability mentioned today. And I know STB, and there are a few STB people perhaps here who I do know. I know they are very interested in seeing how sustainability can be introduced into events and other things. And I think URA has set a very good example with one particular event that I've been personally involved with, and that's the I Light Marina Bay, which is still Asia's first and only sustainable light art event, and probably one of the few in the world, but it's certainly Asia's. So that's got sustainability built into not only its name, but into the policy and practice of the event. So I'd just like to hear from the panel what they think about how we can build sustainability into not only the destination and to make a more livable city, but a more sustainable city, but also into the tourist industry.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Tan. I'm retired. I'd like to ask a question. The panel is our closest city in terms of tourism, I would think, is Hong Kong. So how does Singapore tourism compare to Hong Kong in terms of their strategies? Are they similar to us? Are they sustainable, as one of these gentlemen said? Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, one more question before we throw it to the panel. Yes.
Hi, I'm Shannon from SCP Consultants, from the urban planning field actually. This is a question with regards to PM Lee's recent speech from National Day Rally. It's regarding Project Jewel. So do you think that having a big retail mall at the airport is a critical success factor for Changi to retain its status as an international air hub of the region? How would it affect the vibrancy and businesses in the major retail and entertainment belts located in the city? For instance, Orchard Road, Clarke Quay, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let me summarize the 4 questions again for the panel. The first one being, what would be the next big thing? Since Chin Nam, you promised that you ain't seen nothing yet. So the second question on sustainability about our tourism initiatives and events, such as the Marina Bay Light Up. The third question, how does Singapore's tourism compare with Hong Kong's? And the fourth question, how would a big retail mall at the airport impact on the other retail districts in Singapore? Who would like? Yes. Yeah. You can take them one at a time, or all at a time, or in any order. Yeah. Yes.
I think I'll take the airport one. Last one. Last in, first out. The airport is actually, to me, a very important component, all right, of actually the tourism industry as well. I mean, on its own is important, but I think it's a very important part of tourism. I would call it a symbiotic relations, all right, because for the air hub to succeed, if the destination is not appealing, then it's going to affect the number of people coming, and that will affect your ability to achieve the air hub status. And similarly for tourism, if you don't have a very effective air hub, where you got many people willing to come here, even if it's in transit, maybe come out for a day or two, that again will affect our numbers, our ability to achieve our numbers. So I think we should look at it that actually it's a very important part. And I see STB and CAS and Changi Airport Group, I mean, they have to work hand in hand and work very closely to realize our long-term plan for the country. And I don't think the two plans can be developed separate from each other. Now, I'll come to the jewel question a little bit, just in a couple of minutes, but I just want to touch upon a point that, so PM raised this issue about that with the fifth terminal, he's looking the capacity for the airport will double. Today, I think the capacity for the airport is about 70 million pax. We are doing about 51. I think the capacity is 70. So if we double the capacity, that will bring us to, say, 140, 150 million pax a year. When you count pax, the airport count pax as in and out. So in terms of number of passengers, if you handle, say, 51 like we did last year, agak, you're talking about handling about 26 pax, or if you can count in and out. So I did some calculation. Based on 150 million capacity, and the airport operates on 80% capacity, 80% of that capacity, and if 1/3 of the passengers using our airport are transfer passengers, all right, which is the case today, it is about 1/3. And that Singaporeans make 15 million air trips a year. Today, Singaporeans make about 7 to 8 trips overseas a year, air and sea. So let's assume for air, all right, they make 8 million. So you work through all your numbers. Actually, our airport will have to handle something at 25 to 30 million visitors arrival each year. All right, if we are to meet the requirements of operating 80% of 150 million capacity. So what that means is that if your left hand and a right hand is to be synchronized, what STB will have to do is that you will need a plan, or essentially to see how we're able, or to attract something at 25 to 30 million tourist arrivals a year. All right, and last year we are at 14 million visitors arrival. All right, obviously our target, which we set 10 years ago, was 17 million. So it's still some way to go. All right, I think it's something that's not impossible to achieve, even with that big numbers. Because even at, I reckon that even at 25 to 30 million visitors a year, and based on the same length of stay and everything, we'll be handling about, in my view, about 300,000 tourists at any one time in Singapore. It's quite sizable, but you consider a population of 5 million, 6 million, or maybe 7 million with a white paper. All right, actually the 300,000, 2 to 300,000 tourists a year is really not so impossible to achieve. But you need a plan, all right, essentially to support this initiative with enough attractions, with enough things to do, all right, with facilities that are needed to support, say about 200 to 300,000 tourists a year. Now, let's come back to Jewel. I think the issue really is about how do we see Singapore as a destination, and something that's very unique about Singapore. In fact, when I was in STB, one thoughts that we had as part of our tourism 2015 planning was that we actually see Singapore as the world's biggest transit lounge. Really, because if you're a tourist, all right, you actually can conveniently get to any one of our destinations in Singapore, or in 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes at most. From the Changi Airport, you can get to Marina Bay via ECP in 15, 20 minutes. Orchard Road about same time, or you can get to some of pristine Chinatown or Little India or even a zoo, in actually a relatively short time, as compared to any other cities around the world. In all my years of traveling, I have not come across a city, that is actually quite like us, where you get out of the airport, zoom, and you're already in the city in a very quick pace of time. So in this notion of seeing Singapore as a world's greatest transit lounge, it is idea, that if we can develop a system where our transit passengers or our arrival passengers, All right, all the systems are put in place. Immigration, security, left baggage, and etc. are done in a way, all right, that the tourists can get out very quickly, all right, to enjoy all the things that we have in Singapore, whether it's an ethnic district, shopping areas, our IRs, our zoo, and everything, all right, in a very convenient way, so that tourists who has got, say, 4, 5, 6 hours of transit time, it's still viable, actually, to get out of the airport and spend 2 to 3 hours somewhere, all right, before they get back to the airport, all right, to board a plane. So if we look at it this way, then the issue is that, do we want our tourists to spend more time in the town and in a different attraction, or you want a tourist to spend more time at the airport? Granted that we should develop the airport in as attractive as possible, all right, for arrival passengers and for transit passengers. I think that's still important. Okay, but we got to keep that in mind, all right, if our objective is really to get the passengers and including the transit passengers, all right, to get out to the town to enjoy Singapore, all right, then the way that we size up Project Jewel, all right, is to keep that in mind. All right, because whoever spent $1 billion, $2, $3 billion developing a huge project, you should expect them to do everything they can to keep the passengers in the airport, right? So these are the trade-offs that I think that we have to make as a country. All right, you leave it to the Changi Airport Group. They may make, obviously, they may see things in a certain perspective. But I think it's important that you look at it, take that, and then look at it from a broader perspective and a tourism consideration, and then see it as a wider perspective. And I think our decision may be slightly different, or the sizing of the project may be slightly different. Thank you.
I would like to comment on this transit strategy. Transit is only one particular aspect. Of course, I think if the passengers are being retained at the airport, hopefully they will be happy to part with some of their cash. But I think the whole objective of evolving Singapore into a tourism destination is to entice all the tourists to want to have the real experience in Singapore. In fact, by adopting this is the area of a big idea now, by adopting this tourism unlimited idea, by collaborating with our partners in the region, it could be Bintang, it could be Iskandar, etc., by means of this link product, I think there will be quite possible for passengers to fly into Singapore, so we make money one round, and they fly out to the region, including visiting Angkor Wat, etc., then to come back to Singapore again. So I think we can make money 3 rounds. And in the process, I think they can also part with their money at the Jewel. I think we need to respond, because I think all the airports are becoming increasingly attractive, so I think we must respond. So big ideas, I have got faith in Singapore's innovative capacity. I think our industry is innovative, our government agencies are creative. By working together, I think the next big idea can always come out. I think after the Sports Hub, that will be next year. We will have the National Art Gallery, Victoria Theatre Restoration. There could be many, many other projects and redevelopment which will contribute towards Singapore's enhanced attractiveness. So I think if we were to continue to pursue this particular trajectory, I think Singapore can only be made more and more beautiful, more and more attractive for Singaporeans as well as for visitors. Southern waterfront development, that would be a long-term project, 15, 20 years' time. There will be plenty of scope for architects to put in their input in order to have a new definition of waterfront living. So I think there will be plenty of scope for the public and the private and the people sectors to work together in order to make this country extraordinary for our citizens as well as for our visitors.
That's great. I think I'll put the question about comparing Singapore with Hong Kong to Lik Peng, since you have a quite international perspective on these things.
Yeah, I mean, I know it sometimes looks like an obvious kind of comparison, but Hong Kong is a very different tourism kind of structure to us. They, the very, very large bulk of their tourist arrivals are from China, and they have something in region of 40 over million tourist arrivals, crazy numbers that, Singapore, we're not even getting close to scratching at that. But the vast majority of that is from China, and that's because China is sitting on the hinterland, and often it's just a question of, for them, a half an hour trip. Whereas to get to Singapore, you got to fly a long distance. We'll never reach those type of numbers of Chinese arrivals. So I think, and if you look at their room rates, the growth of the room rates, the number of hotel rooms they actually have a much larger tourism industry than Singapore, in a sense. But that's again because they're very close relation to China, and it becomes an outsized part of their tourism pie. Whereas for Singapore, our largest, Indonesia, I think it will remain the largest for a while. Indonesia is growing very well. Southeast Asia in general is growing very fast, and the minute you have a large middle class, they want to travel, and the first place they want to travel to is Singapore. So, I think in the foreseeable future, our kind of core market will remain kind of Southeast Asia, Philippines, and all these are you look at economic growth. I know the China story has been said a lot about over the last years, and we'll get our fair share, but we'll never approach Hong Kong's level, I think, in terms of Chinese arrivals. I don't know if the panel agrees with me on that. And we probably don't want to get there, We can't cope with that. We can't possibly cope with that number of arrivals.
Yes, which brings us to the question about sustainability. Maybe, Pam, you have seen a lot of things happening over a long time. What do you think about this question about sustainability of our tourism-based events such as Marina Bay Light Up and so on?
Events. Singapore as a sustainable product, it all depends on what's happening around us. And if all looks good, we'll continue to grow and thrive. As for events, tastes change. So you have to be able to change with the taste. And people get jaded so quickly. So I think the art is in the quality of the experience, the depth, and how it befits the visitors and the locals at that point in time.
Sounds like we have to be a really good transit lounge. that kind of ties in some of these questions about competing with Hong Kong.
Don't forget, our people travel so much themselves.
Yes.
The people of Singapore travel so much themselves that they have seen a lot overseas. So unless you can really be something special, or they can relate to you in some way, it's very hard to sustain.
So I guess we have no choice but to continually innovate, like what
innovate or make it so engaging that people must come.
Right. Enticement.
I just want to add to this discussion. All right, just on the issue of sustainability and livability. I just want to reinforce a point that actually, indeed, we work very closely with different government agencies. So when you look at these subjects, it is not really so much of STB working alone to try to make the projects sustainable. There's no need to, because we work so closely with URA, with PUB, NEA, and every agencies. I recall one of the projects that we were looking at, which was a Mandai area. We're looking how to expand the zoos that we had, the zoo, the night safari, the third attraction, and maybe even bringing in one or two more attractions into the Mandai area. I can assure you that we work so closely, all right, with M-Park, URA, and all that, to ensure that if we come up with a product there, it will be something that will meet all the different requirements, including many of the people who are very conscious and very particular about making sure that the animals, all the small little animals, got places to run to. So we don't work alone, and I can assure the people in the audience that we are obliged and we're happy, all right, to work with all the agencies. I think I'm still in STB. Actually, I'm not. Okay. But at least I was trying to do that at that time. Anyway, I got this idea. Since you talk about big ideas, it's not a big idea, but it's something that's close to my heart that I thought might be worth just bouncing this, especially we're sitting in this auditorium that belongs to M&D. I think one areas that and I think to some extent it's also quite consistent with how tourists want their experience to be, right? Going forward in what they're looking for. Is the idea that they are looking for more authentic experiences. All right. I think by and large tourists will not just want to go to a place where they see nothing but just all tourists. It becomes a very artificial experience. All right. Well, at least I as a tourist, I may have a little bit of that, but I make sure that I also got enough time to experience something that's authentically local, all right, to be with the local, so that actually, other than just having a little bit of fun, I also learn something. I also know what this society, what this local is all about. So how we do this in Singapore? I know we have tried very hard to bring tour groups, all that to HDB, bring them to some top building, look at HDB and all that. I think that's fine. I think we can continue to do that and may even do it more effectively and bigger numbers. But I would like to suggest that why can't we have more hotels, all right, in our regional centers, in our HDB estate? Could we not have imagined, say, having a hotel in Toa Payoh Central next to HDB, right, where tourists in there could enjoy all the wonderful food that we have in Toa Payoh Central, next to MRT station that they can easily take and go down to town, all right, and interacting with the locals, and more importantly, even having all the locals, all the shops, retail shop, food outlets and all that, benefiting from the tourists who are staying there. So why can't we have a hotel in Toa Payoh Central? Why can't we have a hotel in, say, in Junction 8? Why can't we have a hotel in Ang Mo Kio? And so many places you can think about in Singapore where it is convenient, all right, for a tourist as well, bringing benefits of tourism into our heartlands. And this is something that URA can do.
I hope you're there in the audience, URA.
And the other suggestions I have really is, homestay is a very attractive proposition. When I go overseas, I always go for bed and breakfast, right? My wife and I, we love bed and breakfast because having to stay with a family gives you a very entirely different experience. I'm not saying you should not stay with Loh Lik Peng. I think you should still stay there. But I think a bed and breakfast arrangement brings you quite a different experience. And some of my stay, some of the trips that I make, I remember for a long, long time because of the interactions, you have with the owner of the house. So why can't we have homestay in HDB flats?
HDB, are you here?
No, today we allow, I think URA and all that allow private condos, private property to a homestay program. In fact, when I was in STB, we supported an organization that actually facilitated in the booking. But I think a major step will be made if we allow that for HDBs. So that, older people, like a guy like me, if I own a HDB, I don't need all the rooms. You can rent out 1 room, 2 rooms. I don't think many people will do, but given our large number of HDB flats, I think you might get a certain reasonable capacity, to be able to take in quite a good number of tourists. I mean, it's income for the old buggers, but it's also a very good experience, for the tourists. So I got 2 ideas here for our friends here in MND and URA. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to invite the next round of questions. Yes, I see a lot of hands in the back. Maybe the gentleman in white, yes, first, and then, yeah.
Hello. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my name is Uwe from Falcon Crest. Mm-hmm. I have some observations. With all these mega projects costing millions, billions of dollars, it has driven up costs in Singapore. Singapore has become a very expensive city to live in. We're talking about livable cities. Now, hotel rates have gone up, real estate have gone up, transportation have gone up. So what happens to the man on the street? So if their income is not going up, all they can do is watch other people enjoy a livable city. They can only watch rich men enjoy a livable city, but not themselves. They are then limited to their HDB and Kopitiam with the mee pok while they watch all the rich people enjoying themselves, where the man on the street is just watching. I mean, that's my observation. And what is the government doing about this? You can give them subsidies, but enough to live and watch. the rich people enjoy themselves.
Okay.
And Singapore is encouraging a lot of rich people coming in here. But of course, a lot of Singaporeans are also very rich, like people on the panel. They will enjoy dinner at the entree, Michelin chef. But the man on the street will never be able to enjoy that. So how do you balance this?
Okay, we got it. Yes. Okay.
Sorry.
Good question. Okay. There was a lady. Wait, is it? Yeah. I think both of you, the two ladies over there. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Mine is actually a reaction and a question. I'm Vian Cortez I'm the regional market analyst of the Spain Tourism Board here in Singapore, and I cover Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. I agree with Mr. Chian, sir, the one in, yes, Mr. Lim, sorry. I totally agree with you when you said something about probably opening up the homes, the HDB homes for tourists, because, I'm discussing with your former colleague here from STV, Mr. Rias, now with Bintan Resorts. It's a good idea, it's a good project, and it's probably a good future projection for Singapore tourism. But then I think we have to consider, for example, the culture here, because Singaporeans, I'm an adopted daughter now, I'm Singaporean, but Singaporeans tend to be really private, and personally, this is just my observation, and I would like to let it stay that way perhaps, because it's connected somehow to the previous observation about Hong Kong. There was a question of how do we compare Hong Kong with Singapore. I was oftentimes...
So what is your question?
Yes, the question is,
yes.
It's probably, that's why I said it's an observation.
Okay.
I agree and
right.
I don't agree at the same time.
Okay.
But the question, my question is, in relation to what you said of, the locals gearing up for tourism and probably making it possible for hotels to be near MRT stations, I'm more for this question of shopping in Singapore, for example. Perhaps we can open up flea markets for the locals, because in the past our office has been approached on this possibility of what has been done in Spain on this aspect, and I think it's probably more an open idea for the locals to be able to sell some products, just like to have a feel of
I think we got the question. I would like to give the chance also to the other lady next to you. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Juliana. I'm currently with the World Bank, but on secondment from the STV. So that will explain why my question is, sorry, not directed at Lik Peng, but at the other three on the panel. I think two-part question. First part, I think three of you all played very instrumental roles in STB. What do you think is your greatest achievement when you look back on it now? And second part to the question, with the benefit of knowing that hindsight is 2020, what would you have done differently?
Okay, I think we'll just take this three questions for now in the interest of time. Just very briefly to summarize, has tourism driven up the cost for the man in the street in Singapore? Number two, can we have more alternatives to big mall shopping, perhaps flea markets? And number three, what has been your greatest achievement? And the second part of the question, what would you have done differently? So,
I think I should address the first one. I do agree that the cost of living in Singapore has gone up. And it is a complex question. Rentals have gone up. The cost of getting produce into Singapore has gone up. The cost of power has gone up. And each year you look at our businesses. Our margins get squeezed because we can't always pass these costs on to the customer. And that is a product in many ways of not just of tourism development in Singapore, but of the fact that Singaporeans and Singapore as a country is getting richer. And at the same time our resource in terms of our land and things like that hasn't necessarily kept pace with that level of development. So, in a sense, you're trying to, I guess, manage that whole issue of how you kind of redistribute wealth and at the same time give the people a reasonable lifestyle. And that's not an issue that maybe this panel can address, because it's not purely related to tourism. But from my level, operating as a restaurateur and hotelier, we feel it all the time. Land costs have gone up tremendously in Singapore in the last 3-4 years. And I have stopped buying property in Singapore. I look for opportunities overseas now for development, simply because it's. I kind of agree that in certain sectors certainly it feels very much like a bubble to me, because when I look at developments, and a lot of hoteliers will tell you the same thing. If you bid for a hotel project now, your costs all in is close to $1 million per room, and your yield is in a low single digit. And there's no rhyme or reason why people should invest in this environment, but people still do. And the same thing with restaurants. When you look at people kind of opening restaurants, and a lot of them are probably not sustainable in the long term. They pitch it at a certain level, saying it's a mid-price kind of thing, and really, you look at the rentals they pay and the manpower costs they have to pay, they're not going to last very long. The numbers you can't run away from. And the only way it sustains is, perhaps you look at some very busy restaurants, and those are the exceptions. Those are the ones who really kind of hit the sweet spot. But, in 2 or 3 years, a lot of the kind of restaurant openings that you see in Singapore with these kind of prices are probably not sustainable. But there is a certain euphoria in the market at the moment, and people are building stuff, and they are opening things that maybe don't have the sustainability, I give you an example. You look at some of the rentals in Chinatown now, in an area that maybe isn't that strong for lunch and will be quite strong for dinner. People are paying on a per square foot basis, $15 to $20 in rental in some instances, and those guys are not going to be in business very long. Those are the economic facts. But at the same time, because there's that euphoria, they do drive out a lot of traditional businesses. There's the Tong Ah in Keong Siak Road that made headlines recently. And you look at the guys who rented that space for $50,000 or $60,000 a month, they're not going to be in business very long, because I just don't think it's sustainable. Singaporeans are not prepared to pay, you're quite right, to pay that kind of money. It's not sustainable.
Maybe the question about housing, one on shopping, if you want to. Otherwise, we can just go through the panel on okay.
No, you answer, please.
Well, the lady there who is overseeing New Zealand. Well, I just want to agree that culture. Spain. Oh, Spain. Okay. Sorry. Now, I agree that culture will obviously be a factor. And I reckon that there may be many families will not want to open up the homes to homestay. But I think the issue really is that we're not forcing anybody. I mean, whoever is not comfortable don't have to join the scheme. But whoever is comfortable, can work arrangements where, there can be some marketing agency that can help to market the flats or their vacancies. So long and short is that it's something that people want to do, take it up. If not, then that's all right. Now, since I'm with the mic here, I just want to. There was a question about achievements. Is it what you do differently? Should I just carry on with that? Or,
I would actually recommend each of you say 2 sentences. What is your greatest achievement, and what would you have done differently, so that we sort of round the session in time? Yes.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
My greatest contribution, I think, was the saving of Singapore's heritage. And what you must know is I did it against a lot of queries, a lot of doubting Thomases. A lot of people quietly did not agree with me. And this includes the saving of the Dragon Kiln and the purchase of the Tang shipwreck treasure, the 9th century treasure. And very often I would hear whispers that actually nobody in so-and-so agrees with you. That kind of thing, So those I consider, and I thank you for the question. What I regret, or what I did not address and wish I had, one day I was driving past Botanic Gardens and I saw a group of Chinese tourists coming, and the men had their T-shirts rolled up and they were sweating and using everything to fan themselves. And I said, sometimes we have such big ideas, but simple little things like giving a complimentary cold, wet towel never occurred to us. That we go out and spend millions to promote Singapore. What if Tourism Board just gave a cold, wet towel that says, something, something Singapore? So that's the kind of thing.
Well, I think the question on contributions should really be answered by the people in the audience. But I think very humbly I would say the value add probably from my side will be in terms of introducing a new perspective, introducing this idea of tourism as a serious business, and it's more than just marketing Singapore as a tourist destination. And I think as I've reviewed quite a lot of materials that I had presented over my 3 years in STB, my conclusion is that quite a lot of the ideas are still relevant and valid today, even though the context has changed. Singapore has changed, but I think many of the thoughts which the industry and STB had worked together would still be a good basis to look at tourism as a total business.
What I have contributed, I would say that I think bringing about a can-do attitude in STB, I think that's probably something that on reflection, I'm very happy. All right, that I make a contribution there. I think my 6 years there, I think I could sense there are many difficult projects that are there, and we don't shy away from doing it. There's always this can-do attitude, go there and give it a shot, put the resources together, and let's do a good job out of it. Still remember when we started F1, none of us really know anything about F1, to be honest about it. So this one of my colleagues gave me a book, F1 for Dummies. That's how I learned about F1. and I think I still remember our focus on achieving our targets and our numbers. I think again you reflect the can-do attitude. I still remember back in 04, 05, one of my colleagues, his name was Kun Hui. I don't know if Kun Hui is here, but Kun Hui came to my office. He was so happy, Hey, Neo Chian, we have for the first time crossed 800,000 visitors in a month. But now we are doing about 1.2, about a month. But in those days when we crossed 800,000, we were watching the numbers. Okay, we were doing everything we can to boost the numbers, see how to achieve our targets. But the people were so excited, when look at numbers going up when we cross 800,000. So I think to me there's this can-do attitude that I'm very happy that was showing during my tenure in STB. What I would do differently, I don't really know. I think
regrets.
I think you could pace different things differently. There are a couple of projects that I never got around to completing them when I left STB. I'm not sure I would have done differently, because at any point at the time when you leave a company, there's always some unfinished business. But obviously, when you reflect back on some of the unfinished business, it's always sometimes with some degree of sadness. You are not stayed long enough to finish the projects. Thanks.
You are still contributing.
Yeah, I've not retired yet. But still. For me, really kind of I think I worked with Neo Chian quite a lot too, and he was a very activist STB chief at the time, which was, for my first experience of kind of working with a senior civil servant at the time. And so I have fond memories of working with Neo Chian. I think the Chin Nam and Pamelia were before my time, although I've interacted with them many times and got very many valuable insights as well. So I'm happy to kind of have worked with all three of them actually.
So it sounds like all of you should still be in STB since you have unfinished business. In spirit. Yeah. No, but no, I think all of us appreciate that you had made sterling contributions to tourism, and Lik Peng is still continuing to expensive restaurants in nice places. And with that, I think we had a great discussion this afternoon, and I'd like to thank the panel for sharing their time with us. We hand the session back to Jean.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists and Lehman for a very interesting, insightful, enjoyable session this afternoon. May I now invite Mr. Khoo Teng Chai, Executive Director of CLC, to present our panelists with tokens of appreciation. Mr. Khoo, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right.
What do you want?
You guys should be in the middle.
Why don't we wrap up first and then we do after? Yeah. Otherwise, guess I'll wait.
One more?